Back in 1999, when I was 25, something terrible happened to a friend of mine. Since everyone has already suffered enough from this story, all the names I'm going to use are fake, but the story is true, and it's been with me and our group for the past 25 years. In April 1999, me and 7 friends decided to head out to Shenandoah National Park. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, and except for Denise, none of my friends had ever been to the Appalachians. We planned to arrive in Rowan, Virginia, and hike a good portion of the Appalachian Trail, all the way from Rowan to Shenandoah National Park. It was definitely the longest hike any of us had ever attempted, but we weren't too worried since there were multiple exit points in case we couldn't finish. Plus, there were 7 of us. We had heard plenty of stories about people going missing, murders, and all kinds of stuff that would scare anyone. But again, we figured nothing bad could happen to us. Besides, Denise was in the army and was really good at navigating with just a map and compass. We felt like we were in good hands. The trail we were going to hike was about 95 miles long and would take around 35 hours to finish. We planned on being out there for 7 to 9 days, depending on how tired we got. Also, the goal wasn't just to hike, but to unplug from our jobs in the city and enjoy some time away. We were super confident, and the only part Denise really warned us about was this one long stretch roughly in the middle of the trip. It was completely isolated for almost 30 miles, and we didn't want to run out of food or water during that part. So we packed the lightest, most nutrient-dense food we could. We were at Walmart buying all our supplies when the lady at the register asked if we were getting ready for a hike. We explained that we were and where we were headed. When we mentioned the Appalachians, the color drained from her face. She went pale, her eyes wide. She told us a lot of people went missing in that area and mentioned sightings of the feral people. We had heard those stories before, but chalked them up to folklore. That's when the guy behind us, in line, chimed in, saying we shouldn't worry. Although the stories were true, most people who saw them didn't have any issues. As long as we didn't mess with them, we'd be fine. I'm not gonna lie, that freaked me out a little. Actually, all of us were a bit on edge. But we'd heard those tales before. It wasn't anything new. The first 2 days of hiking went great. Group morale was high, we were all in our prime, and physically fit. It felt like nothing could bring us down. On the 3rd day, things took a turn. We had set up camp in a clearing just off the main trail and were split between 2 tents. I've always had trouble sleeping, so by 3 a.m., I was still awake. Chloe, who normally had no problem sleeping, was up too because of back pain, so the 2 of us were playing cards in one of the tents. Out of nowhere, we heard footsteps. Our first thought was that someone had gone to the bathroom, but after 5 minutes, we decided to peek out of the tent to see who it was and why they were taking so long. Chloe was the first to look, and from the expression on her face, I knew something was wrong. She stuck her head out again, then quickly covered her mouth with her hand, holding back a scream. Her face was frozen in fear. I took a look right after, and what I saw terrified me. Beyond the trees, where we had left our food, were about 15 people rummaging through our stuff. They didn't seem to be taking anything. They were just checking it out and putting it back. Then one of them, a girl, looked straight at me. My heart raced, and I quickly ducked back inside the tent. Chloe was still covering her mouth, and for several minutes, we just stared at each other, not speaking, barely breathing, trying not to make any noise. Then we heard the other tent unzip. We looked at each other. That tent was closer to where those people were, and it could either be our friends checking out the noise, or it could be them opening the tent. Then we heard a scream. It didn't sound like anyone we knew, but with all the panic, I couldn't be sure anymore. Our tent opened, and Denise stepped inside. She was going to ask if we had seen what happened, but as soon as she looked at our faces, she knew we had. She'd woken up from the noise and scared them off, but she thought they'd come back. There were way more of them than us. The rest of the group had woken up by that point, confused by Denise's scream. After we explained what the 3 of us had seen, Everyone was on high alert. Who were those people, and what did they want? One thing we all noted was that they didn't seem like other hikers. They were all dressed in white. Denise had seen some of the women wearing dresses and sandals, almost like they'd made their own clothes. There was no other explanation but that we'd encountered the feral people. We tried to think rationally. They hadn't shown any signs of wanting to confront us or be violent. There were more of them than us, and they could have hurt us if they wanted to, but Denise alone had been able to scare them off. We decided to stay put until morning. We could take turns sleeping, though no one really felt like sleeping. Around 5 in the morning, John went to grab a bottle of water for a drink. Less than 5 minutes later, he started acting completely euphoric, totally out of it, like he was drugged. That's when it hit us. They hadn't been there to steal anything. They had spiked our water. Denise panicked. She explained that we were in the middle of nowhere, and it would take hours to reach the nearest exit. Plus, this part of the trail was more difficult, and we'd have to push ourselves hard. As if things weren't bad enough, they were about to get worse. Little did we know this was just the beginning. Around 7 a.m., the sun was up enough that we felt okay heading back to the trail in daylight. A couple of hours had passed, and John was feeling a lot better, but when we reached the trail and looked behind us, neither John nor Chloe were anywhere to be seen. I was the last person in line, before them, and had thought they were right behind us the whole time. The next 2 hours were a nightmare. We frantically searched for them, calling their names, but the silence in the forest was suffocating. With each step, the weight of the unknown pressed on us, and the feeling that something much bigger than us was watching started to take root in everyone's mind. We began to see symbols on the trees, strange marks, hand-drawn signs, like warnings that we were trespassing in forbidden territory. Denise was trying to stay calm, but even she was shaken. "They're toying with us," she whispered, more to herself than to us. "They know we're vulnerable." After another 3 hours, we finally reached the nearest exit. We were completely drained, but we managed to explain everything to the police. Their reaction, especially from one of the older officers, made us even more uneasy. The look on his face as I spoke, like he had heard this story 100 times before, and it always ended the same way. The search began immediately. For 3 days, we didn't hear anything. On the 4th day, Chloe was spotted at a gas station, about 125 miles from where she had disappeared. But the Chloe who showed up wasn't the same. She was calm, way too calm, like nothing strange had happened. When asked about John, she casually said she'd left him at his uncle's house in New York. She had no idea we were talking about their disappearance in the Appalachian Mountains or the strange encounter that night. Medical tests showed she was on a variety of drugs. Even after she physically recovered, her mind was shattered. She couldn't remember anything that had happened, as if that time had been wiped from her memory. John was never found. The truth is, none of us were the same after that hike. The group fractured, each of us dealing with the trauma in our own way. The few who stayed in touch eventually drifted apart. About 5 years ago, I heard from Denise. She seemed different, distant. She told me she still dreams of those people sometimes, always dressed in white, always waiting. We don't know what happened, but one thing's for sure. Whatever we encountered in those mountains wasn't peaceful. They had a purpose, and whatever it is, it's not over. Hey, Horror Spectator here. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on post notifications so you're always in the loop when new videos drop. We post 2 videos every week. If you're really into this content, consider sharing it with your friends. It really helps us grow this community. Now, let's move on to the second story. The first time I set foot in the Appalachians was nearly 10 years ago. And since then, whenever I can, I returned to hike the trails. There's something about that vast stretch of green and those rolling mountains that always brings me a sense of peace. Every hike feels like meditation, a chance to disconnect from the chaotic world and just exist in harmony with nature. I was excited about my most recent hike. I knew the trail I planned to follow pretty well, but this time, I decided to explore a bit more. Go beyond, step off the beaten path. Maybe find a new view, something no one else had seen before. The thought of discovering something new filled me with a childlike rush of adrenaline. After a few hours of peaceful hiking, the sound of birds and the rustle of leaves lulled me into a calm state. I decided to stray off the trail a bit. The vegetation was thick, but I felt confident. After all, I'd been in these mountains before, and my sense of direction was decent. It wouldn't be hard to find my way back. That's when I noticed something etched into a large moss-covered rock. "Be aware, you are now trespassing." The words were scratched in what looked like charcoal, roughly scrawled, but perfectly readable. I let out a nervous chuckle. Who would have done that? A bored hunter? Someone with a morbid sense of humor, maybe. I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just a tasteless joke. I mean, who talks about trespassing in modern times? I kept walking, curiosity overriding any common sense I might have had. Not even 20 minutes later, I saw something that made me question my own eyes. By the edge of a small creek, sitting on a rock, was a child. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. She was wearing a white dress, clearly handmade, and had long brown hair that shimmered in the filtered sunlight. For a moment, I thought she was lost, that her parents must be nearby. Maybe distracted. But I didn't see anyone else. My heart began to race. What was a child so young doing alone in the middle of the forest? I looked around, searching for any sign of adults, but all I saw were trees and the sound of the creek trickling. I decided to approach her slowly, trying not to startle her. But as I took a few steps, she seemed to notice me. She turned her head toward me, and in that moment, a chill ran down my spine. Her face was painted white. Not just her face, but her arms and legs too. The paint was uneven, sloppily applied, but clearly deliberate. Something about the way her hollow eyes locked onto mine made my stomach turn. Despite her clean, almost neat appearance, there was something deeply wrong with the scene. She looked like she had stepped out of a horror movie. Panic began to well up inside me, but I tried to stay calm. I asked her if she was okay, where her parents were. The voice that came out of my mouth sounded strangely distant, like it wasn't even mine. The girl looked at me with that blank expression and said, in a soft, almost melancholic voice, that I shouldn't be there, that her father would be very upset. And then, as if it were just a casual detail, she asked me if I hadn't seen the sign. That gave me an even bigger chill. The words scratched into the rock echoed back in my mind like a sinister reminder. Everything in me screamed to leave, to turn and run back to the main trail. But I couldn't just leave a child alone. Not out here. I asked her if she could take me to her parents, and without saying another word, she stood up and started walking into the forest. I followed her, but something about the way she moved unsettled me. She was small, but she moved with an eerie grace, leaping over roots and rocks as if she was dancing with nature itself. I, on the other hand, stumbled over every branch, struggling to keep up. The walk felt endless. We must have been going for more than 20 minutes when she finally pointed toward a ravine. I looked where she was pointing, and what I saw made my heart stop. In a clearing, surrounded by tall, shadowy trees, was a group of at least 50 people, all dressed and painted in white, just like the girl. They were huddled around something, but from that distance, I couldn't tell what it was. They seemed to be involved in some kind of ritual or ceremony. Terror rooted me to the spot. Before I could process what I was seeing, one of the group members slowly turned in my direction. It was as if they could sense my presence, even from that far away. And then, as if they were all connected, every single one of them turned their heads toward me at the exact same time. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. Their gazes pierced through me like I was a trapped animal. For a few seconds, that felt like an eternity. No one moved. Then, one of the men picked something up from the ground. A spear? A stick? I couldn't make it out. Others began doing the same, grabbing objects and slowly moving in my direction. That jolted something primal inside me. Without thinking, I turned and started running. The forest seemed to swallow me as I ran, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the thick underbrush. I knew they were following me. I didn't know how many, but I could feel them, like shadows slipping through the trees. The memory of how that little girl had moved so effortlessly through the forest only heightened my terror. I was in their territory, and that made me vulnerable. They knew every tree, every rock, every dip in the terrain. I was just an intruder, struggling against nature itself. I ran for hours without stopping. The panic gave me strength I didn't know I had, but as the sun began to set, my energy drained. When I realized I wouldn't make it to my car before nightfall, my fear turned into despair. There was no going back. I was trapped. Night fell, and I had no choice but to stop. The darkness was total, and the sounds of the forest now seemed distorted, amplified by my paranoia. I heard footsteps, muffled laughter, whispers that seemed to come from all directions. I knew they were close, watching. Every little noise made my heart leap. The entire time, the feeling that something was moving in the shadows never left me. I stayed awake all night, nerves completely shot, waiting for something or someone to attack me. But for some reason they didn't. Maybe they were just playing with me, drawing out the terror. When the sun finally rose, I got up on shaky legs and ran to my car as fast as I could. When I finally saw it at 6 in the morning, I could barely believe I had survived. As I drove away, it all felt like an unreal nightmare. But I knew it wasn't. I had heard stories about the feral people of the Appalachians, those tribes that supposedly lived deep in the mountains, cut off from civilization. I never believed they were real, but now, after what I'd seen, I know they are. And that little girl, so small and completely separate from the group, only made it all the more bizarre. I've never gone back to the Appalachians, and honestly, I don't know if I ever will.